for joining us on this episode of Disruptive by Design. I'm here with Jarrod from Census for an exciting talk about the inside world of a threat hunter. Jarrod, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thanks. Really appreciate the invite. Thanks to AFCEA for reaching out to us and being able to fit us into your schedule.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time and tell us your current title and who you work for.
So as you mentioned, my name's Jarrod. I work for the company Census. And so we are the world's number one repository of internet-facing scan data. And so my current title is I am the Federal Technical Account Representative. And so whenever we have new business that comes to us, that transitions over to the post-sales team. And so I'm part of the team on the federal side, and I handle all of our government accounts globally currently, and we are building out the team. So I'll have some assistance doing that for EMEA and APAC and some other geographical regions that are a little bit further from the United States.
Right, sure. And take us back, kind of how you got started. What are your degrees in? And yeah, what's the kind of the basis of your education, and then how you got to doing your master's?
Yeah, so growing up, I come from a law enforcement family. My grandfather was a police officer, my father was a police officer and criminal investigator. But I was always very interested in technology, and so I decided to kind of combine those two efforts and go into the cybersecurity world. So I have a associates in computer information systems, and then I have a Bachelor of Science in information system technology with a focus in information and network security. And then I decided to change it up a little bit and kind of steer away from the cybersecurity world and broaden my horizons a little bit with my master's. And so I went with the public administration route, which my father was also an MPA grad. So that kind of led me in those steps because I knew I was going to wind up working in the government sector or the public sector at least. And so having that MPA would likely benefit on that.
Right. And how do you think that's helped you having the MPA? I think that's kind of unique. I haven't talked to too many people in the information science world that has, masters in public or sorry, policy. Can you talk about how that's helped?
Yeah, absolutely. So, along with the coursework of the MPA, it guides you not quite the MBA business route, but it gives you more of the public infrastructure. How does the government work, operate, function from not just a finance standpoint, from a contractual standpoint? How do policies and procedures work within the US government and global government at large? Just because even though this was a focus on US government, it does apply to global governments too. But it at least gave you that knowledge going into it. So if I did, and we'll get into this, but I did go in the public sector, it gave me that knowledge and wherewithal to go into that as well.
Right, sure. And tell us about your alma mater because you're doing some unique things there.
Yes, I graduated from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. So I grew up 10 minutes down the road. My mother was an employee for the university, been around it my entire life. But I supported my MPA program. The program, unfortunately, is no longer at the university, but when it was there, I was part of the advisory board, kind of guiding the curriculum and not some of the information there. I was part of a team of individuals that sat on that board to be able to assist with that. I also am part of the Alumni Association, and I assist with our Central Florida chapter. And so put together happy hours and events and fundraisers and things of that in conjunction with the Alumni Association back in Illinois. And so they'll send representatives down to Florida to do meet and greets, updates on the university, things of that nature. And then I like to give back to my university by either financial or knowledge gain. And so I also support the information system technology department with which I graduated from by stepping in and doing guest lectures and supporting the curriculum there. So the professors at that role will reach out to me every once in a while to be able to jump in and do a presentation on behalf of what I'm currently working on or a specific subject that I might be knowledgeable of.
Right, sure. And can you talk about your specific, kind of give us an overview of what your company does and what you do, but can you kind of delve into kind of what your responsibilities are and how they feed into the greater picture of what Census does?
Yeah, absolutely. So I come out of the operational world. So I was previously in an operational capacity on the U.S. government side doing threat hunting and so forth. And with Census, it provides the tools and tool sets to be able to do threat hunting and risk awareness. And so with my role, I am responsible for maintaining contracts and making sure that those that have done contracts with Census are getting everything out of them that they have purchased. And then also making sure that I provide them metrics and user information, help troubleshooting and supporting. I've got a technical team that supports me in my role, and then I have an entire research team back at Census that can do finished intelligence products and additional research. And so with my role, it's maintaining consistent communication with the customer and making sure that they are pleased with what they're getting out of what they've signed contracts for.
And can you talk about how you got into threat intelligence? Kind of how did that start, and where was your first position?
Yeah, so with my master's in public administration, it's required to do a internship of sorts, with either a nonprofit or on the public sector government side. I actually got my start because a guest lecturer was at my university, which turned out to be the Sergeant at Arms or Chief Law Enforcement Officer at the US Senate. And so he happened to be there because he's from Illinois, was originally Illinois State Police Director. So he was doing kind of what I do with giving back to areas that he has had educational institutions in the past. And I got the chance to meet him and have a conversation about doing an internship. I was able to jump on board as an intern with the United States Senate in 2012, which then led me to my career path because I was working alongside the Security Operations Center at the Senate, and I was able to go back as a contractor for a couple of years and then transition back over to a full-time government employee. And while I was there, this came full circle when I jumped on board with Census in November 2023. I realized that I was originally a beta customer of Census when they first got their start. And so I had access to the data and have seen the program products develop since day one. So that's kind of how I got my start into the threat hunting community. I jumped on board with the Senate and then just kind of dove in head first, and here's where I am today.
Right, sure. And can you talk about being a threat hunter? What are the skills needed for this field? And kind of, I'm sure the threats are only getting more and more sophisticated. And how do you stay on top of, those rapidly evolving, complex threats?
Yeah, so being a threat hunter is pretty difficult. I mean, you kind of have to have the motivation for it just because you are trying to prevent an unknown number of quote unquote bad guys from getting into a network, and you are a single defender or a single defender on a team. And so one misstep or missing something can potentially pose a risk to the entire network and environment. So it's definitely a challenging job finding threats before they find you or find the network. And then I've also seen in the past where we will bring in previous intel folks from military or operational capacities, and it's much easier to train them on the cyber front than it is to train them on intel. I think people that work in this space have a natural ability to do intel and intel gathering. And so I think that's one of the major skills that's needed is you kind of have to have it going into it or have an interest in it. If that's not there, then I think it's going to be a pretty difficult spot for someone to jump into.
Right, sure. And I don't know what you can talk about, but what were kind of the threats that you saw at the U.S. Senate Security Operations Center? And I guess what did you learn from being there?
Yeah, so at a high level, I mean, we're one of the biggest targets on US government networks. So you've got 100 senators and 40 plus committees. All of those are being targeted at all times to include state-run offices and the offices in DC. And so with that, we have a pretty large footprint, especially when senators travel, being able to focus on the travel risks. So wherever they may be going, we're still responsible for making sure that they maintain their devices and maintain the security of that. Uh, Also, it's very important from my perspective when you're doing threat hunting communication. And so I would liaison with multiple agencies. I was also detailed to the FBI's Washington Field Office Cyber Task Force. And so I had that law enforcement arm in conjunction with the Capitol Police arm that was our legislative branch side. And so with that, being able to do threat hunting, it was very heavily focused on the communication aspect of having that conversation, knowing what the threats are that other networks are seeing. And so that kind of gets you ahead of the ball game, not just for today's threats, but for tomorrow's threats and how those are going to develop.
Right. I'm sure with any security operations center, there's the 24/7 operations of, battling threats, every day. But can you explain kind of how you look for tomorrow's threats? How do you position yourself for that, for what's coming down the road?
Yeah, so it's kind of an instinct thing and predictability. I mean, with AI coming into play in the last couple of years, that's going to be huge because it's going to help threat intel analysts start to predict what those threats are going to look like in the future. And so it's going to take that automation game another step. And so it's always beneficial whenever building out threat intel programs that you build in some automation. Obviously, threat hunters keeping eyes on what those look like so you don't miss anything, but with that coming into play, that's going to really assist SOC operations to be able to predict what does the future threat look like, how is it going to evolve. I mean, the lowest bar to entry is going to be the most risky one, and so people are a huge factor when it comes to that. And so security training is always number one, making sure people are aware of what that risk looks like, whether that be an inbound harvesting email or credential harvesting email or something of a threat coming in from a social media site or a link or things of that nature. And so whenever you're thinking of what the tomorrow threat looks like, you have to keep in mind that people are going to be the number one threat, and education and training is number one and should always be number one. And then you move on to the next level of threats to be able to defend networks.
Right, sure. And can you talk about some of the other trends you're seeing? You mentioned automation and the need for, AI and how that can help in threat hunting. But what are the other trends you're seeing that will help threat hunters and then also kind of other trends?
Yeah, I mean, the threat always develops a little bit, so it changes year to year. I'd say in the last year, we've seen a lot more of the ransomware threats of networks being taken hostage and payment being requested. You'll also see a lot of credential harvesting and stealing threats. So someone keeps a post-it or a note or something on their back counter or something, and if they're on a video call and that's observed by someone that's on a group video call, then now you put the risk of the network in the hands of someone else that's being able to log into it. And then with the connectivity of everything across the internet these days, we're starting to see a lot more of different industries being targeted from the Internet of Things types of malware attacks. So it's no longer just critical infrastructure, it's across the board different items that are device connected to the internet. And so you've got that as a risk as well, because one vector of getting into a network is going to pose the entire network at risk.
Right. And what can you kind of gauge or characterize kind of what's at stake as far as these threats?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, like the the ever evolving digital threat for cybersecurity is definitely on the rise. It's continuously going up and up. Uh, as we tie everything to the internet, our risk elevation continues to go up as well. And so building out cybersecurity programs, being able to include some of those new AI-based models and machine learning models are going to be very prevalent when it comes to cybersecurity in the coming years. Being able to build that in an automated fashion to where automated tools will start to take away some of the day-to-day operations of threat intel analysts that are very easy to detect, the low bar to entry, like we talked about a second ago, being able to utilize that information and then being able to shift the model from going from like defending a fortress essentially to like the resilience of being able to embrace like cyber risk and being able to focus on that is going to be very beneficial.
Right, sure. And Census puts out a 2024 State of the Internet report. Can you talk about the main findings there and kind of the threats to devices?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, Census is focused on scanning the internet multiple times a day, looking for devices that are potentially at risk or could pose a risk to a network. So whether that be from an attack surface or from a threat hunter's perspective, looking at what Census covers from all of our global scanners, we did find over 145,000 exposed industrial control system services. And then 38% of those are tied back to North American IP addresses. And so as we dive into that, instead of a malicious actor compromising a water facility through an IT network or specialized malware or something like that, they leverage other internet connected device interfaces, so human machine interfaces or HMIs, for exploiting across public internet. So whenever Census scans into one of these devices, we're not logging into or breaking into any of these devices as per US law, but we can sometimes see what that first login page looks like. And it will give you an idea of who that device belongs to potentially, because a lot of these are just IP addresses across the globe. And starting to look at and monitor some of these industrial control systems with the HMIs that are connected for the login pages. A lot of those are left on default logins or no login required, things of that nature, which then that poses the risk to the network because someone can log into it. And then a lot of these devices are connected to the internet with remote access, which then elevates that risk even more for someone to be able to log into it and then control that device remotely, make modifications, change things, and so forth across the board.
Right. And could you paint a picture if someone was able to get into these industrial control systems, or if they're left exposed, what are some of the potential, what if scenarios that could happen? What are the risks?
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, so humans being the number one threat to networks, a lot of the time these devices are set up so that they're very easy to use. So like I mentioned, it could be a default login that's left on a device. It could be a port that was left open that should not have been left open. Something that was turned on whenever the initial configuration was taking place, but then should have been turned back off afterwards and was just left open. And so these devices are typically pretty easy to manipulate and pretty easy to gain access to. It's a low barrier for entry for industrial control system attacks. They are easily changed, they're easily logged into. And so that's kind of the what if scenario. As soon as someone gets into one of those devices, then they typically have access to a good amount of the network. And then they have the ability to move laterally across different devices inside that network once they gain access through that HMI device.
Right, sure. And how can agencies and critical infrastructure organizations resolve these vulnerabilities and improve their cybersecurity posture?
Yeah, so the attack surface management and continuous monitoring of devices is really important. Knowing what of yours is part of your network. We do find this often with Census to where we will work with a new customer. We will do a scan of an IP range or a host that they know that they have access to, and then detect new devices that they didn't realize were tied to their network or turned on or left open. So the continuous monitoring of devices is very, very important. Know what of yours is touching the internet, know what of yours is open to the internet. And then that's the best way to provide visibility to anybody that's going through and doing patching or controlling networks and being able to support the security operations centers and defenders across the world with the most global picture of the internet and for critical infrastructure.
Right, sure. And we all carry around our cell phones, and some of us can bring them to work and use them all day, but there's organizations, government agencies and the military, especially where people, and most people may not know this, they can't bring their own device into work because of the security risks. But can you talk about some of the BYOD, bring your own device initiatives, such as the one the Air Force and Space Force are advancing? And that program would allow airmen and guardians to access government apps, email, NIPRNet, sensitive data, and other CAC-enabled websites with their own cell phones or their personal devices or tablets, whether they're in the office or not. Can you talk about that kind of program and what the risks are and kind of what you're seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, I've read up on a lot of this, and I think it's great that the Air Force is kind of following the Army's lead on and I learned this as reading through it. It's no longer called just BYOD. It's called bring your own approved device because they don't just allow everything on that network. And so if the device matches the qualifications that are put into the policy for that, then they have the ability to drop it on a network with a specific app and so forth. So obviously the risk is bringing in a device that's not patched and so forth, but they kind of take away that because it has to be an approved device up to a certain operating system and things of that nature. And then the other risk to it is obviously humans just interacting on a secure network with devices. But the other piece to it that's beneficial is they have now overview of what's being dropped on a network, whereas before it would be a private person's cell phone, wouldn't be on an app that they were controlling and have security parameters around. So I think that the way that they're doing it these days is taking away a lot of the risk, just because they have overview of it, they have the ability to track security pieces of it, and so I think it's supporting the airmen and women being able to do their jobs at various locations. And so it makes it a little bit easier and less risky for them to bring that device with the way that they're putting this and implementing it in place.
Right, sure. And those are all my questions, career related, but can you talk about kind of what you do in your free time to balance, from your work and, when you're not focused on threat intel?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love to travel. I'm a global traveler. You can ask anybody that it's worked with me in the past or friends. I love to do that. I love to make new friends at any place I go. When I'm in my hometown of Tampa, Florida, I do support the AFCEA Central Florida chapter there. And so I'll attend the monthly luncheons and have conversations with others at networking events and socials. I am part of the Emerging Leaders chapter there as well. And so I support our team there on different fundraisers and networking socials that we do. I also am part of the NDIA or National Defense Industrial Association as well. And so I'll engage with the teams there. We are one of the largest bases that have two combat commands. So SOCOM and CENTCOM are both at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. And so we do have a very large group that supports us from the AFCEA chapter as well as NDIA. And then I also do a lot of work supporting the Central Florida, or I'm sorry, Cyber Florida group that is based out of University of South Florida. So it's an educational opportunity. I do volunteering at some of the events that they do for training the cyber leaders of tomorrow, essentially. And so working with them is always beneficial.
Right, sure. And I guess how do you balance the pressures of threat intel of, always hunting and having to find these vulnerabilities? How do you, I guess, balance that?
Yeah, so I mean, you got to rely on a team to work on that. And so having conversations with others, uh, that in conjunction with going out with friends and just kind of stepping away from it every once in a while, knowing that you are not going to be the sole defender of a network. You have got to work on a team and rely on others and rely on tools to do so. So I mean, I'm very happy and fortunate to work for a company that their focus is helping defend networks across the globe. My role specifically, federal governments. And so working with my company as well as other network defenders is always beneficial to be able to do that day in and day out. And so that puts me at ease a bit, knowing that we're doing everything we can to help protect US government as well as our friendly partners.
Right, sure. And was there a favorite place that you visited in the last year or so when you were traveling?
I had the opportunity to visit Singapore twice in the last year, and so that was fantastic. First time in that region of the world. It was very eye-opening to see how similar they do have to U.S. traditions and being able to meet up with some of our counterparts there from the U.S. Cybersecurity and intelligence pieces. Uh, they are adapting a lot of the U.S. models when it comes to national homeland security. And so working with them is very beneficial, and I very much enjoyed visiting their country.
Oh, very nice. And those were all my questions. Anything else you wanted to add, Jarrod?
The only thing that I'll add is Census does participate a lot with the AFCEA events. And so I know that we're going to be at AFCEA West here, what is that, next week? 2 weeks. And then we will likely be at the TechNet Cyber in Baltimore. TechNet Augusta coming up in the fall. And then we do participate typically with some of the other ones in the DC, Virginia region, and then Alamo Ace in San Antonio later next year or later this year.
All right, sure. That's a full calendar.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing your insights and experience. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks, Jarrod.